So in this video, we will keep on talking about conventional policies of central banks, and we'll see that these entail a fundamental asymmetry. This will be the main outcome of this video. Basically, a central bank may have to choose between promoting economic growth or keeping inflation at bay. So in this chart, we see how one central bank may be focusing on inflation. And here I take the example of the US, and you see this red line, and it's showing the consumer price index inflation over history. And the blue line is the key tool for doing conventional monetary policy, and that's the interest rate. This is the so-called federal funds rate. Now, we see that in the 70s, we had this oil shock, which produced very high inflation. And the Federal Reserve, the central bank, was trying to cool this inflation down, to bringing it down by raising interest rates very high. And we see that eventually in the beginning of the 80s, inflation came down very sharply and interest rates could ease as well. So here clearly the emphasis at that time was to target lower inflation. But sometimes it may have another goal, and this other goal is to promote growth. Indeed, after the crisis of 2007 to 2009, the main objective of all the central banks has not been to target inflation, because inflation was nowhere to be seen, but, except, as we have said now in some countries like Brazil, but indeed the priority was to promote growth. So here we see these interest rates which are at rock bottom, at zero. They cannot go below that. In theory, some central banks have actually managed to put interest rates in negative territory, but this is very, very unusual. So we have these two goals which may be conflicting. And actually, with central banks, we talk about, and you remember this video where I show all these animals and this menagerie in finance. And here with central banks, we talk about doves and hawks, les faucons et les colombes. Doves are people within the central bank that put the priority on maximum employment and want to use monetary policies, whether conventional tools or unconventional ones, but the priority is to promote growth. On the other hand, you have the hawks, and those are the people that say, hey, the main threat for an economy is high inflation. So here they want to raise interest rates the minute they foresee inflation, even if it's way, 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 way down in the future, but they'd rather be cautious and raise interest rates preemptively in an attempt to choke off future inflation. So here we have the two main differences in the central bankers, those who want to target employment and growth, and those who want to curtail inflation. So the doves and the hawks. Okay, when we talk about this latter objective, i.e. to stimulate growth, one very interesting example is to have a look at Japan. And Japan has been going for many, 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 many years into the so-called ZIRP policy. This is zero interest rate policy. And you see here the interest rates is at rock bottom and has been there, this red line, for many, many years in an attempt to stimulate growth. But, and this is the main problem with central bank policies, is that central bank policies, monetary policy, entails a fundamental asymmetry. Very simply said, it is far easier for a central bank to cool an overheating economy where there's too much growth and too much credit demand than it is to stimulate the economy when we've had a crisis like the 2007-2009 crisis. And indeed, we have this fundamental asymmetry because when central banks fear inflation, what they just need to do is raise interest rates to whatever level is needed to cool down demand. If you put interest rates in the US now at 10, 15% like in the 70s, then people will stop buying houses and stop borrowing money to buy cars or whatever it takes to have the US dream, right? But here, it's just sufficient for the central bank to raise interest rates at a sufficiently high level, and demand will come down and inflation will be lowered. But the other objective of trying to stimulate growth does not work necessarily. Indeed, what the central bank has been trying to do in the US, in the Eurozone, in Japan, everywhere, is bring interest rates down. And in so doing, basically what they're doing is they are increasing the gains which banks make between borrowing money at the central bank virtually at zero and lending this money for credit purposes to the real economy, to basically consumers and also the corporate sector. Okay? The problem is, if banks don't want to lend, then nobody is forcing them, right? So even if the margin, even if the gain they make is huge, thanks to this very generous central bank policy with this conventional tool of interest rates, and if the margin on interest rates is very high, but they don't want to lend because maybe they have already too many loans on their balance sheet, and this is the case of Japan. Japan has been having non-performing loans in the balance sheet following the bursting of the bubble in the late 80s. And so even though the central bank put interest rates at zero, the banks would not lend. And this is why the Japanese economy has been so weak for all these decades and has been actually into a deflation territory. So it is far easier for a central bank to stop growth than it is to promote growth. And we can illustrate this with this nice allegory. And you see some pictures here. In French, we have this expression. And I remember when I was at university, my professor of macroeconomics was a person called Jean-Pierre Dantine, and he became later vice chairman of the Swiss National Bank. And he was actually my PhD director for my thesis. And he used to tell me already then, Michel, don't forget, a central bank can bring the donkey to the fountain, but it cannot force it to drink. That's actually the French expression. You know, on peut amener l'âne à la fontaine, mais on ne peut pas le forcer à boire. The English say this otherwise, but it's the same meaning. The English say you can lead a horse to the river, but you cannot force it to drink. Okay, you see here this. Oh, by the way, this is a quiz for you. Going back to the previous picture, who do you think is right? Is it the lady that is trying to pull the donkey to the fountain, or is it the lady that is pushing the donkey to the fountain? This is something for you to reflect. But going back here to this, famous expression of leading a horse to the river and forcing it to drink, well, the Americans, as you can see from this picture, have found a way. And indeed, the US banks have been much more, and we see this on this chart, we see that the US horses, in fact, are more thirsty than the European ones, because we see that both central banks have been conducting a very expansionary monetary policies since the crisis, the Great Recession, as we called it. But banks have been into the lending game much more so than the European ones. And this is why economic growth in the US has been recovering much faster and is currently much higher post-economic crisis, post-Great Recession, than in the Eurozone. We can talk about the reasons of why this is so, but basically we can say that in the US, what was done immediately after the crisis was a program which cleaned the balance sheet of the banks. This was the so-called TARP, Trouble Asset Removal Program. And basically, this enabled banks to be very quickly back in the lending game than in Europe. So in Europe, we typically had the situation where the horse would not drink the water which was all this liquidity which was provided by the central bank, and this is why the economic growth has been very dull in the Eurozone. So, conclusions. Central banks may have different, we saw in these two videos that they may have different but converging goals. Some central banks believe that if you target low inflation, this will ensure higher growth. I'm not sure about that, but this is how many so-called monetarist central banks think. Ideally, this is principled by this first Nobel Prize, Jan Tinbergen, who said you should have as many tools as you have objectives. So you cannot kill two birds with one stone, you need two stones here. Interest rates, we saw this is the main tool for central banks when we talk about conventional policies. And last but not least, we saw here that there's a fundamental asymmetry in monetary policy. It's far easier to cool down an overheating economy than it is to try to revive an economy which has been into a severe recession.